Charlie Chaplin's story begins in the busy streets of London in the late 1800s. The world was changing quickly. Factories filled the air with smoke. Horse carriages rattled through cobblestone streets, and children played barefoot on the corners. But for one little boy named Charles Spencer Chaplin, life was far from playful. He was born on April 16, 1889, in a very poor part of London. His parents were stage performers, but their success was short-lived, and the family soon faced very hard times. From the very beginning, Chaplin's life was marked by struggle. His father, Charles Chaplin Sr., was a singer, but he was also a man who drank too much. When Charlie was just a baby, his father left the family, leaving his mother, Hannah, to take care of him and his older brother, Sidney. Hannah was a music hall singer and actress, but she suffered from mental health problems and could not keep a steady job. Charlie remembered nights when there was almost nothing to eat. He and his brother would go to sleep hungry, listening to the noises of London outside, wishing for bread. Poverty became a daily reality. At times his mother could not afford rent, and they moved from one shabby room to another. Finally, when things became too difficult, young Charlie and Sidney were sent to a workhouse, a place where poor children lived and worked in exchange for food and shelter. The workhouse was cold, strict, and lonely. Charlie was only 7 years old when he experienced this. For a child who longed for love and laughter, it was a place of silence and rules. But instead of breaking him, these early struggles taught Charlie something important. He learned to survive. He discovered that if he could make people laugh, even for a moment, he could forget his pain. When Charlie was not in the workhouse, he spent time on the streets, watching people. He carefully studied how they walked, how they moved, how they spoke. Every stumble, every funny gesture, every little moment of human weakness caught his attention. Without realizing it, he was training himself for the career that would later make him famous. Charlie's first true chance to perform came from his mother. Once, when Hannah lost her voice during a music hall performance, little Charlie, only 5 years old, was pushed onto the stage to continue the act. At first, the audience laughed at the sight of such a small boy, but then Charlie began to sing and mimic the style of popular performers. The crowd clapped and cheered. For the first time, Charlie tasted the joy of applause, but life was not kind. Hannah's mental health grew worse, and she was eventually placed in an asylum. Charlie and Sidney were left to survive on their own. Sidney, the older brother, found work on ships, while Charlie struggled to find small jobs. He polished shoes, carried packages, and sometimes begged for coins. Still, his heart longed for the stage. At the age of 9, Charlie joined a group of young dancers called the 8 Lancashire Lads. He had no proper shoes, but he danced with energy and charm. His natural gift for performance caught the attention of others, and he soon found himself acting in small theater roles. He played in children's pantomimes and slowly began to learn the world of acting. Charlie's big break came when he joined Fred Karno's comedy troupe, a popular traveling group known for slapstick performances. Fred Karno was famous for spotting young talent, and he saw something special in Chaplin. The boy had sharp timing, expressive eyes, and a way of moving his body that made people laugh without a single word. With the troupe, Charlie toured across Britain, performing in crowded theaters. The audiences loved him. He was soon chosen to travel with the Karno troupe to America in 1913. For Charlie, this was like stepping into a new world. The streets of New York were alive with lights, cars, and energy he had never seen before. But more importantly, America had something that was about to change his life forever: motion pictures. In America, films were becoming more and more popular. Silent films were shown in theaters, and audiences filled the seats to watch short comedies and dramas. When Chaplin first saw moving pictures on a screen, he realized that this was the future. He wanted to be part of it. His chance came when he signed with Keystone Studios in Hollywood in 1914. At first, he was just another actor in short films, but Chaplin's creativity stood out. He began to develop a character unlike any other, a poor tramp with a bowler hat, baggy trousers, oversized shoes, and a small cane. This character looked silly, but he was full of charm and heart. When Chaplin walked onto the screen as the Tramp for the first time, audiences laughed and fell in love instantly. Children giggled at his clumsy steps, adults smiled at his clever tricks, and everyone admired the kindness hidden behind his eyes. Chaplin had found the key to success. He wasn't just acting, he was connecting with people's emotions. From that moment, Charlie Chaplin's life began to change. The boy who once begged for bread in London was now on the path to becoming the most famous comedian in the world. But his journey was just beginning. When Charlie Chaplin arrived in America, he was just another performer in Fred Karno's comedy troupe. The year was 1913, and New York was bursting with life. Theaters were packed, and vaudeville shows were everywhere. But something else was happening. Moving pictures were taking over. Silent films were becoming the most popular form of entertainment, and Hollywood was quickly becoming the center of this new industry. Chaplin had no idea that his life was about to change forever. In 1914, he signed a contract with Keystone Studios, a company famous for short slapstick comedies. At first, he felt like an outsider. He didn't know much about film acting, and the style at Keystone was very fast, loud, and chaotic. But Charlie had something different. He believed comedy was not just about silly chases or people getting hit on the head. He wanted comedy with heart. During his first films at Keystone, Chaplin experimented with costumes. One day, he put together a strange outfit: baggy pants, a small bowler hat, oversized shoes, a cane, and a tiny toothbrush mustache. He combined the look of a gentleman with the clumsiness of a tramp. This mix created a character that looked funny and poor, but also carried dignity. This was the birth of the Tramp. The Tramp was not like any other comedy character at the time. He was clumsy, yes, but he was also kind. He would stumble, fall, and get into trouble, but at the same time, he cared about people. He was an outsider, a dreamer, someone who wanted to belong but never quite fit in. Audiences immediately saw themselves in him. When Chaplin first appeared as the Tramp on screen, the world took notice. The audience laughed, but they also felt sympathy. Here was a man who had nothing, yet he carried himself with pride. He was poor, but he had charm. He was clumsy, but he had heart. The Tramp became an instant sensation. In just a year, Chaplin went from a newcomer to a star. By 1915, people across America were lining up to see his films. His short movies were playing in theaters everywhere, and his image appeared on posters, newspapers, and magazines. Children copied his funny walk, and adults admired his clever comedy. Chaplin was no longer just an actor. He had become a cultural phenomenon, but Chaplin was not satisfied with just being funny. He wanted control over his work. He believed that to create true art, he needed to write, direct, and edit his own films. So, at the young age of 26, he began taking charge behind the camera. He studied every detail, every scene, every gesture, every movement of his characters. He was a perfectionist, often shooting the same scene dozens of times until it was just right. His hard work paid off. In 1915, he signed with the S&A Film Company, where he gained more freedom and created films with deeper emotion. One of his most famous early works was The Tramp, 1915, which told the story of a kind-hearted wanderer who helps a farmer's daughter but ends up walking away alone. This was not just comedy, it was comedy mixed with sadness. It was something new, something the world had never seen before. Chaplin believed that laughter and tears belonged together. He once said, "Life is a tragedy when seen in close-up, but a comedy in long shot." He lived by this idea, turning his painful childhood memories into touching, funny stories on the screen. By 1916, Chaplin had become the highest-paid actor in the world. He signed a contract with the Mutual Film Corporation for an incredible $670,000 a year, an amount so large at the time that newspapers called it a king's ransom. With this freedom, Chaplin created some of his finest short films, including The Floorwalker, The Fireman, and Easy Street. These films combined slapstick humor with social themes, showing the struggles of ordinary people. Audiences adored him. In the streets, people imitated his walk, children wore fake mustaches to look like him, and theaters advertised his films as events. Chaplin was no longer just a film star. He was a symbol of hope during difficult times. In a world where poverty and struggle were common, the Tramp gave people a reason to laugh and to believe in kindness. But Chaplin was not only thinking about comedy. He was also learning how powerful film could be as a language. Unlike theater, film could reach millions of people at once. Unlike books, it did not need translation. Everyone, no matter where they lived or what language they spoke, could understand his gestures, his falls, and his smile. This made Chaplin a global star. His films were not just popular in America, but also in Europe, Asia, and beyond. Wherever people gathered to watch movies, they recognized the Tramp. In fact, Chaplin became one of the very first international celebrities, beloved across the world. Still, success brought pressure. Studios wanted more films, audiences wanted more laughs, and the media wanted more stories about his private life. Chaplin was young, rich, and famous, but he was also perfectionist and restless. He wanted to do more than short comedies. He wanted to tell longer, more meaningful stories. This desire led him to start working on feature-length films. In 1921, Chaplin released The Kid, his first full-length movie. But before reaching that point, his journey through the 1910s was a story of transformation. From a poor London boy to the most famous face in the world. After years of short comedies, Charlie Chaplin was ready to prove himself with something greater. In 1921, he released his first feature-length film, The Kid. The story followed the life of a poor man, played by Chaplin, who finds and raises an abandoned child. The film was not only funny but deeply emotional, reflecting Chaplin's own childhood struggles with poverty and abandonment. Audiences wept as much as they laughed, and The Kid became an international success. It showed that Chaplin was more than a comedian. He was a true storyteller. The success of The Kid gave Chaplin confidence to explore more ambitious projects. Throughout the 1920s, he made films that were both entertaining and artistic. The Gold Rush in 1925 became one of his most famous works. Inspired by stories of people searching for fortune in the Klondike, Chaplin turned hardship into humor. One of the most unforgettable scenes showed him cooking and eating his own shoe. The audience roared with laughter, yet they also understood the deeper message about survival and human resilience. Chaplin himself once said that this was the film he most wanted to be remembered for. In 1928, Chaplin created The Circus, another masterpiece that won him special recognition from the Academy Awards. The film told the story of a man who accidentally becomes the star of a circus while trying to escape trouble. Behind the comedy, the film reflected Chaplin's real life, his struggle with fame, pressure, and the desire to belong somewhere. But the 1920s were not only a time of success for Chaplin, they were also filled with personal struggles and scandals. His fame made him a target for gossip and public criticism. His relationships, especially his marriages, were often troubled and surrounded by controversy. Newspapers wrote about his affairs, his divorces, and even court battles. Chaplin, who made millions laugh on screen, often felt lonely and misunderstood in his personal life. Despite the scandals, Chaplin continued to rise as one of the most influential figures in cinema. Unlike many others in Hollywood, he resisted the wave of talking pictures that began in the late 1920s. When sound arrived with films like The Jazz Singer in 1927, the industry changed overnight. Silent films were disappearing, and many silent stars lost their careers. But Chaplin believed that comedy was universal and did not need words. He continued making silent-style films well into the 1930s, even when everyone else embraced sound. This decision was risky, but it worked. In 1931, Chaplin released City Lights, one of his greatest films. It told the story of the tramp who falls in love with a blind flower girl and tries to help her regain her sight. The film mixed comedy, romance, and tragedy in a way no one had ever seen before. The final scene, when the girl realizes who her true benefactor was, remains one of the most touching moments in film history. Albert Einstein himself attended the premiere, and audiences worldwide praised Chaplin for his courage to remain silent in an age of sound. By now, Chaplin was not just a star, but a global icon. His films were shown in every corner of the world. From Europe to Asia, people recognized his walk, his mustache, and his cane. He had become the face of laughter during a time when the world faced wars, depression, and hardship. His character, the Tramp, represented hope, resilience, and the simple joys of being human. Yet the pressures of fame continued to haunt him. Chaplin often worked endlessly on his films, repeating scenes dozens of times until he found the perfect expression. His attention to detail was unmatched, but it also left him exhausted. He expected perfection not only from himself but from everyone around him. Some admired him for this dedication, while others found him difficult to work with. As the 1920s ended and the 1930s began, Chaplin faced a choice: follow the industry into sound films or continue to trust his own instincts. For Chaplin, the answer was clear. He would remain true to his art. He once said, "Words are cheap. The biggest thing you can say is elephant." He believed that emotions, gestures, and expressions spoke louder than any dialogue. And as long as audiences kept laughing and crying with him, he was right. The 1920s had taken Charlie Chaplin from a silent film star to a living legend. He had created some of the most memorable works in cinema, built a fortune, and captured the hearts of millions. But behind the applause was a man still searching for peace in his personal life, still haunted by his troubled childhood, and still determined to bring laughter to a world that desperately needed it. His story was far from over. The next decade would bring even greater challenges, and one of the boldest moves of his career. The 1930s brought huge changes to the film industry, but Charlie Chaplin refused to be left behind. While most actors rushed into talking pictures, Chaplin stayed with silence a little longer. He believed the language of gestures, expressions, and movement was stronger than words. His audience agreed, and in 1936 he released one of his most famous films, Modern Times. The world was in the middle of the Great Depression. Millions of people were out of work, factories were closing, and poverty was everywhere. Chaplin decided to tell the story of the tramp trying to survive in this harsh new industrial age. The film showed him working on an assembly line, being swallowed by giant machines, and struggling to find happiness in a world ruled by technology and money. One of the most memorable scenes showed Chaplin caught inside the gears of a huge machine, turning like a cog in the system. It was both hilarious and tragic. Audiences laughed at his clumsy fight against modern life, but they also saw the reality of their own struggles. Many critics called Modern Times a masterpiece because it captured the pain and hope of the 1930s with comedy that spoke to everyone. By the late 1930s, the world was heading toward war. Adolf Hitler had risen to power in Germany, and his shadow was spreading across Europe. For Chaplin, who had always used film to comment on society, this was impossible to ignore. In 1940, he took the boldest step of his career by releasing The Great Dictator. This was his very first full-sound film, and it was unlike anything the world had seen before. In it, Chaplin played two roles, a poor Jewish barber and a dictator named Adenoid Hinkle, a direct parody of Hitler. With the same small mustache, Chaplin and Hitler looked shockingly alike, but Chaplin used this to turn hate into laughter. The film mixed slapstick with powerful political satire. There were scenes of Hinkle dancing with a globe like a child playing with a balloon, mocking Hitler's hunger for world domination. But the film was not only comedy. In the final speech, Chaplin dropped all humor and spoke directly to the audience, calling for peace, humanity, and compassion. His words became one of the most famous speeches in film history, a plea for a better world where people care for one another instead of fighting wars. When The Great Dictator was released, the world reacted strongly. Some praised Chaplin for his bravery, while others criticized him for mixing comedy with politics. But the film became a massive success and gave people hope during dark times. It showed that laughter could be a weapon against tyranny. Still, Chaplin's decision to speak out on political issues brought him trouble. Many people in America thought he was going too far. They wanted entertainers to make people laugh, not to lecture them about world affairs. Chaplin, however, believed that art had a duty to say something important. He had lived through poverty, war, and injustice, and he used his films to shine a light on them. As the 1940s continued, Chaplin's personal life also drew controversy. His relationships with younger women became scandals in the newspapers, and his political views made him a target. He was accused of being too sympathetic to communism, especially during the years of World War II and the Cold War. Although he never joined any political party, his outspoken support for peace and his criticism of capitalism angered many powerful people. Despite this, Chaplin continued to work. He created films like Monsieur Verdoux in 1947, a dark comedy about a man who marries and murders women for their money. The film shocked many of his fans, who expected light-hearted humor from him, but Chaplin defended it as a reflection of a world filled with greed and violence. He argued that if society could accept mass killing and war, why be shocked by one man doing it for profit? It was a daring message, but it also deepened the suspicions against him. By now, Chaplin was not just a comedian. He was a voice, a symbol, and a man unafraid to challenge authority. But in America, this was becoming dangerous. The political climate was tense, with McCarthyism and anti-communist hysteria spreading. Chaplin's films were still popular, but his image was changing. He was no longer seen only as the beloved Tramp, but also as a controversial figure whose personal life and politics were under constant attack. Still, during these years, Chaplin remained true to himself. He had built a career on turning struggle into comedy, on mixing laughter with truth, and he refused to change for anyone. Even as newspapers criticized him, even as politicians questioned his loyalty, he kept creating stories that made audiences laugh and think. Modern Times and The Great Dictator were more than films. They were bold statements about humanity. Through them, Chaplin reminded the world that comedy was not only about escape, it was also about facing reality with courage. The little Tramp, who had once been just a funny character with a cane and bowler hat, had become a global symbol of resistance, kindness, and hope. But the storm around him was growing, and soon, Chaplin would face one of the greatest challenges of his life: exile from the very country where he had built his fame. By the late 1940s, Charlie Chaplin was no longer just the world's most famous comedian. He had become one of its most controversial figures. In America, where he had built his career, the political climate was changing. The Cold War was beginning, and fear of communism spread through Hollywood and beyond. Anyone with left-leaning views or outspoken opinions risked being accused of disloyalty. Chaplin, who had always spoken about peace, equality, and humanity, soon found himself at the center of suspicion. He had never become a U.S. citizen. Although he lived in America for decades, he kept his British nationality. Many saw this as a lack of loyalty. His films, like The Great Dictator and Monsieur Verdoux, carried strong social and political messages, and some critics claimed he was spreading dangerous ideas. Newspapers labeled him a communist sympathizer, though he denied ever belonging to any political party. But in those tense years, denial was not enough. At the same time, Chaplin's personal life made headlines almost as much as his movies. His relationships with younger women fueled gossip and scandal. He faced lawsuits, paternity cases, and constant negative press. Once celebrated as a genius of comedy, he now found himself painted as immoral and untrustworthy by many in the American media. In 1952, Chaplin planned to travel to London for the premiere of his new film, Limelight. He boarded a ship with his family, expecting to return to Hollywood afterward. But while he was away, the U.S. government took action. The Attorney General announced that Chaplin would not be allowed back into the country unless he agreed to face questioning about his political beliefs and morals. For Chaplin, this was too much. After years of giving joy to American audiences, he felt deeply insulted. Instead of fighting to return, he made a decision that shocked the world. He would never live in the United States again. Chaplin and his family settled in Switzerland, in a beautiful home overlooking Lake Geneva. The house, called Manoir de Bain, became his refuge. Here, far from Hollywood, he found peace with his wife, Una O'Neill, the daughter of famous playwright Eugene O'Neill. Una was much younger than Chaplin, but their marriage was strong, and together they raised 8 children. While the scandals of his past followed him in the newspapers, at home he found stability and happiness. Although exiled from America, Chaplin did not stop working. In Switzerland, he continued to write and create. Limelight, released in 1952, was a deeply personal film about an aging comedian who helps a young dancer find her confidence. Many saw it as Chaplin's reflection on his own career, his fears of fading fame, and his love for the stage. While the film was not a success in America at the time, it was praised in Europe and later became recognized as one of his most touching works. In the 1950s and 60s, Chaplin made a few more films, though none reached the legendary heights of his earlier works. A King in New York, 1957, was a satire about American culture and politics, filled with sharp criticism of McCarthyism and paranoia. It was bold, but it also confirmed to many that Chaplin was bitter toward the United States. In 1967, he released A Countess from Hong Kong, a romantic comedy starring Marlon Brando and Sophia Loren. The film was highly anticipated but failed at the box office. By then, Chaplin's time as a leading filmmaker was clearly coming to an end. Yet even if his later films did not achieve the same success, Chaplin's influence only grew. Younger generations discovered his classics, and film historians celebrated him as one of the true pioneers of cinema. His Tramp character, with the bowler hat and cane, became a symbol of silent film itself. His style, mixing laughter with sadness, inspired directors around the world. In his private life, Chaplin enjoyed his years in Switzerland surrounded by his family. Friends and visitors described his home as warm and lively, filled with music, laughter, and children. The man who had once grown up hungry in the streets of London now lived in comfort, though he never forgot the struggles that shaped him. Then, in 1972, something extraordinary happened. After 2 decades of exile, the United States invited Chaplin back. He was to receive an honorary Academy Award for his incalculable effect in making motion pictures the art form of this century. At first, Chaplin was hesitant, but eventually he agreed. When he appeared on stage at the Oscars in Los Angeles, the audience rose to their feet. The applause lasted for 12 minutes, the longest standing ovation in Academy Award history. It was as if the world was finally saying thank you for everything he had given. That moment was one of the most emotional of Chaplin's life. Tears filled his eyes as he accepted the award, humbled by the love he felt from the crowd. The little tramp, once banned and humiliated, was now celebrated again as a legend. The following years were quiet. Chaplin's health began to decline, and he spent most of his time with his family at Manoir de Bonne. He wrote his autobiography, reflecting on his long journey from the slums of London to international stardom. He never stopped being curious, always thinking about art, music, and the human spirit. On December 25, 1977, Charlie Chaplin passed away in his sleep at the age of 88. He left behind a legacy that shaped the very language of cinema. His films, blending laughter and sadness, continue to inspire new generations. He had taken the pain of his own life and turned it into joy for millions. Charlie Chaplin was more than a comedian. He was a thinker, an artist, and a man who believed that film was not just entertainment, but a universal language. While many actors and directors in the early days of cinema were simply trying to make audiences laugh or cry, Chaplin was carefully shaping an art form. His unique style and philosophy made him stand out, and even decades after his death, his work continues to inspire filmmakers all over the world. At the heart of Chaplin's art was his character, the Tramp. With his small mustache, bowler hat, baggy trousers, cane, and funny walk, the Tramp became one of the most recognizable figures in film history. But Chaplin's genius was that he did not simply make the Tramp a clown. Instead, he gave him heart, dignity, and humanity. The Tramp was poor, awkward, and often unlucky, but he was also kind, gentle, and full of hope. Audiences loved him not just because he was funny, but because they saw a reflection of themselves in him. Chaplin's philosophy of comedy was simple but powerful. Laughter and tears belonged together. He believed that true comedy came from real life, from struggle, from the small tragedies that everyone experiences. He once said, "Life is a tragedy when seen in close-up, but a comedy in long shot." This meant that pain, when looked at from a distance, could become funny. He used this idea in nearly all of his films, turning moments of hardship into scenes of humor that touch the heart. Take The Gold Rush, for example. The scene where the Tramp boils and eats his shoe is both absurd and heartbreaking. The audience laughs at the ridiculous image of a man chewing on shoelaces like spaghetti, but at the same time, they feel the desperation of hunger. In City Lights, the comedy of the Tramp trying to impress a blind girl is filled with warmth, but the ending, when she finally realizes who he is, brings tears. Chaplin had the rare gift of making people laugh and cry within the same story. Another part of Chaplin's style was his attention to detail. He was known for being a perfectionist. On set, he often filmed scenes again and again until every movement, every gesture, and every expression was exactly right. Sometimes he spent days working on a single scene. His crew often grew frustrated, but Chaplin never gave up until he captured the magic he wanted. He believed comedy was a delicate art, and timing was everything. Unlike many directors of his time, Chaplin also had full control of his films. He wrote, directed, acted, edited, and even composed the music. At a time when most actors relied on studios to handle production, Chaplin became one of the first true auteurs, a filmmaker whose personal vision shaped every part of the movie. This gave his films a unique personal touch. They were not just products of a studio, they were expressions of his soul. Music played an important role in Chaplin's work. Although he never learned to read or write musical notes, he had a strong sense of melody. He would hum or play tunes on the piano, and professional musicians would help him arrange them into full scores. His compositions, like the theme from Smile, used in modern times, became classics. The music in his films always matched the mood, moving smoothly from comedy to sadness, from light-hearted joy to deep emotion. Chaplin also believed that film was a universal language. Silent films, with their reliance on gestures and visual storytelling, could be understood anywhere in the world. A poor farmer in India, a factory worker in Russia, or a family in America could all laugh at the tramp's adventures. Words were not needed. His movements, his expressions, and his humor spoke to everyone. This universality helped Chaplin become one of the first truly global stars. His influence on other filmmakers is impossible to measure. Generations of directors, from Federico Fellini to Woody Allen to Richard Attenborough, have spoken of how Chaplin shaped their understanding of film. His ability to blend comedy with serious themes showed that movies could be both entertaining and meaningful. He proved that film could tell stories about poverty, injustice, and human dignity without losing its power to make people laugh. Chaplin also paved the way for comedy as an art form. Before him, slapstick was often seen as cheap entertainment. But Chaplin raised it to a new level. He turned pratfalls, chases, and gags into poetry. His movements were not random. They were carefully choreographed, almost like dance. Each stumble, each twirl of the cane, each wide-eyed glance was planned with precision. Beyond comedy, Chaplin's philosophy of life influenced his films. He believed in kindness, in the importance of love, and in the resilience of the human spirit. Even when the tramp walked away alone at the end of a film, the audience knew he carried hope in his heart. That hope is what people carried with them when they left the theater. As cinema grew into a global industry, Chaplin remained its most beloved figure. While other silent film stars faded when sound arrived, his legacy endured. His refusal to rush into talking pictures seemed risky at first. But it showed his confidence in his art. Even when he finally used sound in The Great Dictator, he did so with purpose, delivering one of the most powerful speeches in film history. Chaplin's style was timeless because it was rooted in human experience. Technology would change, sound and color would arrive, but human emotions remained the same. Chaplin understood this better than anyone. He took the pain of his childhood, the struggles of his youth, and the loneliness of fame, and he transformed them into stories that spoke to the world. His philosophy can be summed up in the words he once spoke: to truly laugh, you must be able to take your pain and play with it. That is exactly what he did, and through him, the world learned to play with its pain, to laugh through tears, and to find light even in the darkest times. Behind the camera and away from the bright lights, Charlie Chaplin lived a life that was often as dramatic as his films. Fame had given him riches and admiration, but it had also brought loneliness, failed marriages, and scandal. For years, his personal life was a subject of gossip in newspapers and magazines. Yet in the end, Chaplin found peace in a family that gave him the love and stability he had always searched for. Chaplin's early relationships were troubled. He was a man deeply dedicated to his work, often spending months or even years focused on a single film. This perfectionism left little room for family life. His first marriages especially were stormy and short-lived. He married several times, often to much younger women, and each time the press followed every detail. Court cases and accusations filled headlines, and his personal choices were criticized almost as much as his political views. But in 1943, something unexpected happened. Chaplin met Una O'Neill, the daughter of famous American playwright Eugene O'Neill. Una was just 18 years old, while Chaplin was 54. Their age difference shocked many, and the relationship was heavily criticized at first. But unlike his earlier marriages, this one would last a lifetime. Una was quiet, graceful, and supportive. Where Chaplin was restless and intense, Una was calm and steady. She accepted his fame, his past scandals, and his demanding personality. More importantly, she gave him a home filled with love and children. Together, they would go on to have 8 children, creating the large family Chaplin had longed for since his lonely childhood. Life in their Swiss home, Manoir de Ban, was very different from the Hollywood world Chaplin had left behind. The house overlooked Lake Geneva, surrounded by peaceful gardens and mountains. Inside, it was filled with laughter, music, and children's voices. Visitors often described the home as lively and warm. Chaplin, who had once wandered the streets of London as a poor child, now enjoyed a life of comfort, sitting at the piano, reading, or playing with his children. Each of his children grew up with a father who was both a legend and a very present parent. Although Chaplin was older than most fathers, he was deeply devoted to his family. He loved entertaining them, telling stories, and even acting out comic scenes at home. His children often said that their father never stopped being the Tramp. His humor and playfulness carried into family life. Several of his children followed artistic paths of their own. His daughter, Geraldine Chaplin, became a successful actress, appearing in films like Dr. Zhivago, and later portraying her own grandmother, Hannah, in Richard Attenborough's biographical film, Chaplin. Another daughter, Josephine, also became an actress, while his other children pursued careers in different areas of art and culture. Chaplin himself tried to keep his family away from too much publicity. After the pain of his years in America, when newspapers seemed to attack his every move, he wanted his children to grow up in peace. Switzerland offered him this protection. The press occasionally visited, but life there was quieter, free from the constant spotlight of Hollywood. Still, the world never forgot who Chaplin was. Fans traveled from across the globe just to catch a glimpse of him. Visitors to his home often described him as gracious, kind, and sometimes shy, very different from the bold performer they had seen on screen. With his children, he was tender and playful, but with strangers he could be reserved, even guarded, shaped by years of criticism and fame. Family life also helped heal some of the wounds of his past. Growing up, Chaplin had known the pain of being abandoned by his father and separated from his mother. With his own children, he tried to give them the security he had never known. Though strict at times, he was also affectionate. Una, as his partner, created an environment where Chaplin could finally relax, away from the battles of Hollywood politics and scandal. The large family also brought him inspiration in his later years. Chaplin often said that his children kept him young. Surrounded by laughter, he found joy in simple things: walks in the garden, meals together, evenings with music. His home became his stage, and his children were his most loyal audience. Yet, even as he built this family life, his public image remained complicated. To many, he was still the exiled genius, the man banned from America during the Cold War. To others, he was a legend whose films had changed cinema forever. Chaplin himself seemed to find comfort in the fact that his films continued to live on. Even if his personal reputation was sometimes debated, his family stood by him during difficult times, especially in later years when his health began to fail. They protected his privacy, cared for him, and reminded the world of the human side of the legend. For Chaplin, who had once felt so alone as a child, this loyalty meant everything. Through Una and their children, Chaplin finally experienced the stability he had always missed. The scandals of his past, the controversies in America, and the years of loneliness were softened by the warmth of family life. It was in this setting that Chaplin spent his final years, surrounded by love, music, and laughter, the very things he had always given to the world. By the early 1970s, Charlie Chaplin had been away from America for 2 decades. The country that once adored him had turned its back on him, and he had built a new life in Switzerland with his wife and children. But while Chaplin lived quietly in exile, the world never truly forgot him. His films continued to play in theaters, studied by young filmmakers, and cherished by audiences who found joy and meaning in the Tramp. Slowly, time softened the anger that had once surrounded him. What remained was the memory of a man who had shaped cinema. In 1972, something extraordinary happened. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences decided to honor Chaplin with an honorary Oscar for his incalculable effect in making motion pictures the art form of this century. It was an invitation for him to return to the very place he had left in bitterness 20 years earlier. At first, Chaplin was unsure. He had been deeply hurt by the accusations and the rejection he faced in the United States. But with Una by his side, he decided to accept. Perhaps it was time to close the circle. When Chaplin arrived in Los Angeles for the Oscars, he was greeted not with suspicion or anger, but with admiration and love. The Hollywood he returned to was very different from the one he had left. New generations of actors and directors now saw him not as a political figure, but as a pioneer, a legend whose films had defined their art. On the night of the ceremony, Chaplin walked slowly to the stage. He was 82 years old, frail, and needed help to move, but the moment he appeared, the entire audience rose to their feet. What followed was one of the most powerful moments in Academy Award history. For 12 minutes, the audience clapped, cheered, and cried. It was the longest standing ovation ever given at the Oscars. The world was welcoming him back. Chaplin, visibly moved, struggled to hold back tears. He looked out over the crowd, actors, filmmakers, stars of the new Hollywood generation, and he smiled. After years of exile, humiliation, and scandal, this was his redemption. His voice shook as he accepted the award, thanking the Academy and the audience for the honor. In that moment, the man who had once been branded an outsider was embraced again as cinema's greatest son. The following year, Chaplin returned to the United States one more time, this time for the re-release of his classic film, Limelight. When the film was shown in Los Angeles, it became eligible for awards, and in 1973, Chaplin received another Oscar, this time for Best Original Score, which he had composed for the movie decades earlier. It was a rare case of Hollywood giving delayed recognition, and it meant that even his later overlooked work was finally appreciated. These late honors were more than just awards. They were symbols of forgiveness, a way of rewriting history. For Chaplin, who had given so much to film and asked for so little in return, it was a final acknowledgement that his art had outlived controversy. In his later years in Switzerland, Chaplin often reflected on his life. He wrote an autobiography, sharing his memories of childhood poverty, his struggles, his triumphs, and his philosophy of comedy. He often spoke about how pain had shaped his art, how laughter had saved him, and how film had become his voice to the world. He believed strongly in humanity, in kindness, and in the power of art to bring people together. Even as his health declined, Chaplin remained curious and creative. He spent hours reading, writing, and listening to music. Surrounded by his family, he enjoyed the simple pleasures of life that had once seemed so distant during his years of hardship. His children brought him joy, and Una remained his constant companion, always protecting him from the outside world. Visitors to Manoir de Ban described him as gentle and wise in his old age. Though his body grew weaker, his eyes still carried the sparkle of the Tramp, the same playful light that had captured the hearts of millions. He often entertained his grandchildren with small tricks and jokes, never losing the instinct to make people smile. For Chaplin, the final decades of his life were not about fame or controversy, but about peace. He had lived long enough to see himself honored again, his films celebrated, and his legacy secure. The struggles of his youth, the scandals of his middle years, and the bitterness of exile all faded in the shadow of his achievements. What remained was the laughter he had given the world and the humanity he had placed at the center of his art. The 1972 Oscar ceremony became a symbol of his journey, from a poor child in London to the world's most famous comedian, to an exile cast out by America, and finally, to a legend embraced again by the same industry that once rejected him. Chaplin's life was a story of resilience. His return to the Oscars was not only his redemption, but also a moment of healing for Hollywood itself. In those final years, Chaplin had nothing left to prove. His films spoke for him. His character, the Tramp, remained timeless. And his influence on cinema was beyond measure. For him, the journey was complete. In the last years of his life, Charlie Chaplin lived quietly in his home in Switzerland, far away from the noise of Hollywood and the controversies of the past. His estate, the Manoir de Ban, stood on the edge of Lake Geneva, surrounded by beautiful gardens and mountains. For Chaplin, it was more than a house. It was a place of peace, the safe home he had never known as a child. By now, Chaplin was an old man. Age had slowed him down, but his mind remained active. He spent his days reading, writing, and enjoying time with his family. He often sat at the piano, playing melodies, some of which he had composed many years earlier. Visitors described him as gentle and reflective. Though his health was failing, he still carried the charm and humor that had defined him all his life. His wife, Una, devoted herself completely to caring for him. She protected him from the stress of the outside world, handled his affairs, and created a warm environment where he could spend his final years surrounded by love. Their children brought energy and laughter into the home, reminding him of his younger days. Chaplin, even in his 80s, loved to joke and tell stories to them, often slipping into the comic routines that had made him famous. To his children, he was not only a legend but a father who made them laugh at the dinner table. But time was catching up. Chaplin suffered from a series of strokes that left him weaker each year. By the mid-1970s, he was mostly confined to a wheelchair, no longer able to walk with the funny shuffle that the world had once adored. Still, he found joy in small things: the sight of his grandchildren, the sound of music, the quiet beauty of the Swiss countryside. On Christmas Day, December 25, 1977, Charlie Chaplin passed away in his sleep at the age of 88. The news spread quickly around the world. For many, it felt like the end of an era. The man who had given laughter to millions, who had turned silent film into art, was gone. Tributes poured in from every corner of the globe. Filmmakers, actors, and fans spoke of how Chaplin had shaped cinema and inspired their lives. His funeral was small and private, held near his home in Switzerland. Only close family and friends attended, but around the world millions mourned. In cinemas, Chaplin's films were shown again, and people remembered the little tramp who had made them laugh and cry. From London to New York, Paris to Tokyo, newspapers carried his picture, calling him one of the greatest artists of all time. Yet even after his death, Chaplin's story took an unusual turn. In March 1978, just 3 months after his passing, his grave was robbed. 2 men dug up his coffin and tried to hold it for ransom, demanding money from Una. The shocking crime made headlines worldwide. But Una refused to pay, saying that Charlie would have found the whole situation ridiculous. The thieves were eventually caught, and Chaplin's body was recovered and reburied in a concrete-lined grave to prevent further attempts. The strange incident only added to the legend of a man whose life had always been dramatic. As the years passed, Chaplin's legacy grew even larger. His films, once thought to belong only to the silent era, proved timeless. Generations who had never known silent film watched The Kid, City Lights, Modern Times, and The Great Dictator, and found them just as moving as audiences had decades before. The Tramp became a symbol of resilience, kindness, and humanity. A character who could cross cultures and languages without ever speaking a word. Film scholars studied Chaplin's work as examples of perfect storytelling. Directors praised him as the first true master of cinema. His ability to mix comedy with tragedy, to turn personal pain into universal laughter, was seen as genius. He was compared to Shakespeare and Dickens, artists who captured the spirit of their times while speaking to all of humanity. Museums and retrospectives around the world began to honor him. In 2016, his old home in Switzerland, Manoir de Ban, was turned into a museum called Chaplin's World, where visitors can walk through his life and relive his films. It became a place where fans from every continent could connect with his story. But perhaps Chaplin's greatest legacy was not just in film history, but in the way he changed how people saw comedy. Before him, comedy was often just about laughs. After him, it became an art that could carry deep meaning. He proved that laughter could heal, inspire, and even fight injustice. His work influenced countless comedians and filmmakers, from Buster Keaton and Laurel and Hardy to later artists like Woody Allen, Roberto Benigni, Rowan Atkinson, and Richard Attenborough, who would eventually make a film about Chaplin's life. Chaplin's story was also a lesson in resilience. From the workhouses of London to the studios of Hollywood, from exile to redemption, he had lived through poverty, fame, scandal, and triumph. Through it all, he never stopped creating. He once said, "To truly laugh, you must be able to take your pain and play with it." That was exactly what he had done, turning the hardships of his childhood into comedy that touched the world. When people think of Chaplin today, they do not only see a man with a bowler hat and cane, they see a symbol of humanity itself, a reminder that no matter how hard life gets, laughter can carry us through. Charlie Chaplin's life was more than the story of a great actor or director. It was the story of a man who turned suffering into art, who believed in kindness above everything, and who showed the world that laughter could be as powerful as words. Even decades after his death, his work still feels alive, still speaks to people in every corner of the globe. What makes Chaplin timeless is not just the comedy, but the heart inside it. The Tramp was funny, but he was also human. He slipped on banana peels, stumbled over his cane, and got into endless trouble, but he also helped strangers, cared for children, and dreamed of love. He represented every ordinary person who struggled to survive yet refused to give up hope. That is why people from different cultures and generations continue to connect with him. They see themselves in his character. Chaplin also changed the way people thought about cinema. Before him, movies were often seen as simple entertainment, a novelty for crowds to enjoy for a few minutes. Chaplin proved that film could be art. He showed that a camera could tell deep stories, express emotions, and capture the struggles of real life. His films were not only comedies, they were portraits of humanity. In City Lights, he showed the beauty of love and sacrifice. In modern times, he criticized the dehumanizing effect of machines in industry. In The Great Dictator, he used humor to fight hate and delivered one of the most moving speeches ever filmed. His influence spread far beyond Hollywood. In India, the great filmmaker Satyajit Ray admired him. In Italy, directors of neo-realism saw Chaplin as an inspiration. In France, artists compared him to great painters and poets. Around the world, comedians borrowed from his style, learning how to use body language and timing to make audiences laugh. Even today, you can see traces of Chaplin's Tramp in characters like Mr. Bean, who speaks little but communicates everything through movement and expression. But Chaplin's legacy is not only in film. His life story itself is a lesson. He began with nothing, born in poverty, abandoned by his father, separated from his mother, and forced to survive in the workhouse as a child. Yet he rose to become one of the most famous men in the world. His story reminds us that hardship does not have to define the future. With creativity, resilience, and determination, it is possible to turn pain into strength. Chaplin also taught the world about the importance of empathy. In his work, he always stood with the poor, the weak, and the outsiders. His characters often faced hunger, injustice, or ridicule, but they met those challenges with dignity and humor. He made audiences not only laugh at the misfortunes of the tramp, but also feel compassion for him. In this way, he reminded people to see the humanity in others, even in those who seem forgotten. His philosophy was simple. Life may be difficult, but laughter makes it bearable. He once said, "A day without laughter is a day wasted." To him, laughter was not just amusement, it was survival. It was a way to rise above pain, to resist despair, and to hold on to hope. That message is as powerful today as it was in his time. Even in the age of advanced cinema, special effects, and digital storytelling, Chaplin's silent films still capture attention. They prove that great storytelling does not depend on technology but on truth, emotion, and creativity. His films continue to be screened in festivals, taught in film schools, and watched by new generations who discover that black and white silent images can move them more than any modern blockbuster. The museum built at his home in Switzerland, Chaplin's World, allows people to walk through his life and his art, showing how his story belongs not only to history, but also to the present. Fans who never lived in his time still visit to pay tribute, showing that his influence has no expiration. Perhaps the most lasting lesson of Chaplin's life is that greatness does not mean perfection. He was far from perfect. He faced scandals, criticism, and exile. His marriages often failed. His politics caused anger, and his personal choices were sometimes questioned. But despite his flaws, his art reached the deepest parts of the human spirit. He showed that even imperfect people can create something beautiful, something eternal. When we watch Chaplin's films today, we are not just watching old comedies. We are watching a man who poured his life into every frame, who took the sadness of his childhood, the loneliness of his exile, and the complexity of his world, and transformed it into joy for millions. His films remind us to keep our heads high even when life knocks us down. They remind us that laughter is a form of courage. Charlie Chaplin once said, "We think too much and feel too little. More than machinery, we need humanity. More than cleverness, we need kindness." These words, spoken in The Great Dictator, are perhaps his greatest gift to the world. In a time still divided by conflict, greed, and inequality, his message remains urgent. Be kind, be human, and never lose the ability to laugh. Chaplin's story began in the slums of London and ended in a peaceful Swiss village. In between, he lived a life of extraordinary highs and painful lows. But above all, he gave the world a legacy of laughter, compassion, and art that will never fade. The tramp may walk off into the distance at the end of his films, but he never leaves our